Some more examples subtracting decimals. So let's say we want to figure out what 2 minus 1.2 is. Pause this video and see if you can calculate this. So there's multiple ways to tackle this. One way is you could say, look, this is the same thing as 2 minus 1, 2 minus 1 minus 2/10. This is 2 minus 1 and 2/10. So we were subtracting 1 and we're subtracting 2/10. Now 2 minus 1 is pretty straightforward to compute. 2 minus 1 is going to be 1, and then we need to subtract 2/10 from that. So 1 is the same thing as 10/10. We could say this is 10/10. 10, let me write it this way, 10/10. And we're going to subtract 2/10. What is that going to give us? Well, that's going to give us, if we have 10/10 and we take away 2/10, that's going to give us 8/10. Let me write it down here. 8/10, which is the same thing as 0.8 or 8/10. One way to think about this is if you're subtracting 0.2 from 1, if you view this 1 as a 1.0, instead of expressing this as 1, 1, and 0/10, we are thinking about this as 0 ones and 10/10. And when you think about it as 0 ones and 10/10, well, 10/10 minus 2/10, it's easier to then think about, well, 10 of something minus 2 of something is going to be 8 of something. It's going to be 8/10. Now, we can also visualize this on a number line. So, for example, let me draw a number line here. And so 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. That's 1. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. That is 2. So we're starting at 2, and we're subtracting 1 and 2/10. So one way to think about it is we first subtracted 1. And then we subtracted 2/10, and that got us to the point 8/10 on the number line. Another way to think about this, and the whole point here is to see multiple strategies and for you to think about what strategy you like the most and to realize they all get you to the same place if you're thinking about it in a reasonable way, is you could use what's the difference between 2 and 1.2? So 1.2 sits here on the number line. So what's the difference between 2 and 1 and 2/10? Another way to think about it is, how many tenths do you have to add to 1 and 2/10 to get to 2? Well, if you've already got 2/10, you need to add another 8/10 to get to the next whole. So you have to add 8/10, or you have to add 0.8. So the difference between 2 and 1.2, the difference between 2 and 1.2 is equal to 0.8. Let's do a few more examples that get a little bit more involved. So let's say we want to calculate what 3.8 minus 1.5 is. Pause the video and see if you can calculate this. Well, just like before, we could view this as 3 minus 1, so we're subtracting the 1s, plus 8/10 minus 5/10 minus 5/10 minus 5/10. Notice we have 3 and 8/10 minus 1 and 5/10 minus 1 and minus 5/10. And so now we can figure out, okay, 3 minus 1, that's just going to be equal to 2. And then 8/10 minus 5/10, well, that is 3/10. And so this is going to be 2 and 3/10, which of course we could write as 2.3. That seemed pretty straightforward. Let's do one that's a little bit more involved. Let's say we want to calculate 4 and 5/10, or 4.5, minus 2 and 8/10, or 2.8. Pause the video and see if you can calculate this. So you might want to do the exact same thing. You might say, okay, well, this is the same thing. Let's think about the ones. This is 4 minus 2 plus 5/10 plus 5/10 minus 8/10 minus 8/10. 4 and 5/10 4 and 5 tenths minus 2 and minus 8 tenths. Minus 2 and 8 tenths. That's exactly what we have up here. And you'd say, all right, 4 minus 2, that is 2. But then you get to 5 tenths minus 8 tenths. And there's multiple ways to tackle this. But you might say, well, how do I take away 8 tenths if I've only got 5 tenths here? And there's a bunch of strategies that you could think about. You could say, hey, what if I can get some more tenths here? So this is 5 tenths minus 8 tenths. What if I could get some more tenths here? And the best way I could think of it is like, what if I were to break up these ones? Because 1 is 10 tenths. So I could view a 2. I could view a 2 as 1 plus 1. Or I could view this as 1 plus 10 tenths. 10 tenths. So if you view a 2 as 1 and 10 tenths, you can then just add those. You can then figure out what is 10 tenths plus 5 tenths plus 5 tenths minus 8 tenths minus 8 tenths. What is that going to be? Well, this is a little bit more straightforward. 10 tenths plus 5 tenths is going to be 15 tenths. And if you have 15 tenths and you take away 8 of them, you're going to be left with 7 tenths. So this gets us to 1 plus 7 tenths. So all of this, when you compute it, that is 7 tenths, which I could write as 0.7, which is equal to, so this is equal to 1 and 7 tenths. Now there's other strategies that you could do here. One strategy and this is the one that I typically do in my head, is I write this as 4.5 minus 2.5 minus 0.3, or 4 and 5 tenths minus 2 and 5 tenths minus 3 tenths. Now why did I write it this way? Because I find this pretty straightforward to compute, and then once I get that answer, I just have to take away 3 tenths. So for example, well, if I have 5 tenths here and I'm taking away 5 tenths, those are going to knock each other out. And so I'm just going to be left with 4 minus 2, which is going to be 2. And then I have to take away the 3 tenths. Then I have to take away the 3 tenths. And this is a pretty straightforward way of doing it in your head. So what's 3 tenths less than 2? Well, you can visualize a number line in your head. Well, that's going to be 1 and 7 tenths. 1 and 7 tenths. And if this feels strange how I got, I wrote 7 hundredths, 1 and 7 tenths. And if this seems strange how I got there that fast, just think about this. This is the same thing as 1 plus 1 minus 3 tenths. And this 1 right over here is the same thing as 10 tenths. And so 10 tenths minus 3 tenths, that over there is going to be 7 tenths. So it's going to be 1 and 7 tenths, which is what we got before. So the whole point here is to appreciate that there's multiple strategies for subtracting decimals, some that you can do a little bit more automatically, but it's really good to think about what's going on in your head. And some strategies are actually better in your head than on paper, or at least more easy in your head.